Well, shalom, everybody. Welcome to David Halevi Show. Welcome to the Rooted Kingdom. Today we have a really special guest. It's a man that I greatly respect and met him a number of years ago, if you might recall, and actually had him on our Jew and Gentile radio podcast when I was doing that with Aaron Marshall. Of course, now we switched to this platform. But without further ado, I'm going to bring on Dr. Gerald McDermott. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And before we get into questions, I just want to give you guys a bio here, because immediately you probably have some questions just like, okay, what is that guy a Catholic priest? Like, what's going on here? What's he doing on your show? So Dr. McDermott, he teaches at Jerusalem Seminary, Kramer Theological House in Dallas, Reformed Episcopal Seminary in Philadelphia. That's a ACNA. He's retired Anglican chair of divinity at Beeson Divinity School. That's when we last had a conversation when you were there in Birmingham, Alabama in 2020. He has written lots and lots of books, and we're going to get into some of those titles. But I initially knew you from Israel Matters. And I don't remember who recommended that book to me. It was Israel Matters, Recovering the Religious Roots of American... No, that's Race and Covenant, excuse me. Israel Matters was Why Christians Must Think Differently About the People and the Land. Fantastic book. And then you followed that up editing the New Christian Zionism, Fresh Perspectives on Israel and the Land through InterVarsity. But I heard you on a Michael Heiser podcast, God rest his soul. Of course, Michael's now gone to be with the Lord. And lots of things that I agree with Michael about, lots of things I disagreed with him about. But I immediately latched on to you because I don't remember exactly what was going on in the interview, or even what you guys were talking. I'm assuming it was something with Zionism. I'm not really sure because you've written a ton of books, so who knows what you were talking about. But he said something and you go, well, Michael, that's supersessionism. Michael, that's replacement theology. Like, you believe replacement theology. It's like, no, it's more nuanced than that. And you said, no, let's back up and talk about this, and you really pinned him down. I was like, this is a guy that I could get learn from. So welcome to the David Halevi Show. Really appreciate you being here.
Well, it's my great pleasure, David.
Now, before we get really into the nitty gritty, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're probably the foremost scholar on Jonathan Edwards. Is that overstating things? Or I know you've done a lot of work.
Well, who knows? I have done eight books on or about Jonathan Edwards. I've probably published about 100 articles related to Jonathan Edwards. I've done a lot in Jonathan Edwards, and in terms of printed words, I don't know of anyone else who has more printed published words, and there might be somebody or two. But
and what drew you to that? What drew you to him?
Well, I was in grad school at the University of Iowa, and I was fishing around for a dissertation topic. And I knew he was this giant, this intellectual giant. I mean, most Americans have heard of him. Mm-hmm. They've read his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in high school or college, and they think of him just as a hellfire and damnation preacher, which he was. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the good things about him, frankly. We need more hellfire and damnation these days when people who believe in God think God is love and he would never have the heart to send anyone to hell. That's contrary to Scripture, both Old and New Testament. And Edwards was one of the ones who lifted that up. But what most Americans don't realize about Edwards is he was the greatest American philosopher before the Civil War. In fact, frankly, before the 20th century. He set the terms of the philosophical debate for the 19th century all the way up to the beginning of the 20th century. Yale University Press, and he was this giant theologian, the number one theologian in the history of Christian thought. Now I'm talking Catholics, Protestants, Pentecostals, Eastern Orthodox. The number one theologian in the history of Christian thought, the last 2,000 years, for whom beauty was at the center of his theological vision. There are only three names in the history of Christianity who focused on beauty. There's St. Augustine back in the 4th and 5th centuries. There's von Balthasar, the Catholic, in the 20th century. And there's Jonathan Edwards in the 18th century. and historians of America of Christian aesthetics, theology of beauty, say there's no one who comes close to Jonathan Edwards. Yale University Press finished about 12 years ago the critical edition of his collected works, and you'll see all the printed edition behind me in part of your screen. 73 volumes, 400 to 800 pages each, and that's not even everything that he wrote.
Wow.
So he was this, those who know something about the American religious mind and American religion generally agree he was the greatest American religious mind, North or South America, bar none, and the greatest Christian thinker on the beauty of God. He was also the greatest theologian of revival. He published several treatises on revival. So that's what drew me to him. And, once you see the beauty of a great thinker, beauty draws, and beauty has continued to draw me. But I've gone, but I'm not, I would say, a slavish devotee of this thinking, because I disagree with him on some points. And I've made that clear in my last book on Edwards, which really is my magnum opus, in which I put my thinking in most of my 24 previous books. And this is called A New History of Redemption. But I take his thinking as my outline, and it's called A New History of Redemption. He and put my own flesh on the bones of his outline, and it traces the history of redemption in modest fashion. I speak tongue in cheek here. From before the creation to the new heavens and the new earth.
Wow.
And I'm following his outline there. But I put in all my stuff. I've done 7 books on the world religions. I put in all that stuff in there. And I was so pleased to discover, because I had a wake-up call on the meaning of Israel 25 years ago. I was a supersessionist. I have to confess my sins here. I was a supersessionist for many years as a theologian. I was an avid disciple of Tom Wright. Your audience probably knows him as N.T. Wright.
Right.
And a personal friend. And I was his personal host for 2 of his tours in the United States. And I had a wake-up call 25 years ago. And then about 15 years ago, when I decided I was going to try to finish what Edward started, because this was going to be his magnum opus, his Summa. And when you think of it, Thomas Aquinas' 2 Summas. This was going to be Jonathan Edwards' Summa. He was going to finish what he'd started in his posthumously published sermons called A History of Redemption. But he never got to finish them because of the side effects of a vaccine that he took.
No kidding. Wow.
No kidding. And so in my hubris 15 years ago, I thought to myself, I'm going to take a crack at finishing what Edwards started. And so this became my magnum opus, A New History of Redemption. And there's 2 themes in it. And the same 2 themes were in his original. Number one, that Israel is the key to the whole history of redemption, to the whole history of the world. Number 2, God's beauty is also a key to the whole history of the world. And you can only see God's beauty best by tracing the history of redemption from before the creation to the new heavens and the new earth.
Wow. Well, so you're working on that now, or that's...
No, that's what was published in 2024.
Okay. Well, shoot, I got to go get that.
Published by Baker Academic.
Okay.
And it's called A New History of Redemption.
Wow.
New History of Redemption.
Well, before we go any further, because I want to touch briefly on that, I guess, road to Damascus experience you had while you were in Israel.
Yes.
But before that, because a lot of people won't be able to listen any further until they actually understand why is he wearing a collar?
Yes.
So
Well, go ahead.
no. In your own words, and you're an Anglican priest. So, I mean, we kind of said that in the
Yes.
beginning with the intro and everything, but
Right.
people are saying,
Right.
well, is he married? Does he have kids? Like, what's going on? Is that Catholic? Is that Protestant? Like, what is that?
Well, this year, my wife and I, so I am married, we're celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary.
Wow, Mazal Tov.
And we have 3 sons and 3 wonderful daughters-in-law and 14 grandchildren. Actually, 2 are in heaven, so we have 16 grandchildren and 14 here on earth.
Wow.
So, yes, I am married, and I'm an Anglican priest. And one reason I'm sure I always wear my collar when I do interviews like this. I do lots of interviews, lots of podcasts, is to show the world that there are Anglicans. In fact, the majority of Anglicans are Zionists.
Wow.
And the most famous ones in podcasts, like Tom Wright, although he is a friend, is supersessionist. And the Church of England is horrible on these things. And I published an article which I sent to you, David, with 2 of my fellow Anglican theologians a week ago Sunday at the Christian Post. And and we show in that article that the majority of Anglicans, probably 80% of them around the world, most of them are in the global South, are actually very sympathetic to or are actual Zionists. Contrary to the wicked stuff coming out of the Church of England. And most of us who are the 80% of the world's Anglicans, and by the way, your viewers will notice occasionally I stutter. And I am a stutterer. And I wrote a book. One of my books is called Famous Stutterers, 12 Famous Stutterers from Moses to Marilyn Monroe.
Wow.
And so we 3 Anglican theologians in the article that was published a week ago Sunday at the Christian Post, we show that 80% of the world's Anglicans 3 years ago in 2023, in what was called the Ash Wednesday statement, we broke formally from Canterbury,
Wow.
from the Church of England in England, and say we no longer recognize its authority over us because it's long since rejected Christian truth, biblical truth, long since. And although we've been trying to ignore the Church of England for 20, 30, 40 years, we formally broke and declared a new beginning for the Anglican Communion 3 years ago.
Yeah. Wow. And I think it's really important for people to understand. Look, again, well, not again, but like, I'm not Reformed. I'm a Jewish believer in Yeshua. I think it's extremely important that the views that we hold with confidence. Yet, what I so admire about you and your lack of hubris, actually, in actuality, is that you reserve and I reserve the ability to change my mind if truth comes about that should change our mind, which should change our worldview, which should change our view of God and Scripture and everything else. Because I always say, I want to live in a world that's real. And if I believed a lie, now that I'm living in a reality that doesn't exist, and I'm forming my worldview on a reality that doesn't exist. But real briefly, as briefly as you can, kind of tell how you went from supersessionism, or what people probably know as replacement theology, to a worldview that views the Jew as superior. No, I'm kidding. That's what people want to force down our throats, right? No, but in your own words, there you go.
I would say, concerning your last phrase, not the Jew as superior, but the Jew as chosen by God.
Right.
Which doesn't mean saved. Those two things are not the same thing.
Exactly.
So 25 years ago, I was leading a church tour of Israel. And the first 2 days, we went from biblical site to biblical site, both Hebrew Bible site and New Testament site. And I would give my spiel as a theologian. And our guide was a young guy who was working on his PhD in Second Temple Judaism at Hebrew University. and his name was Brian at the time. Now it's Baruch, and you might know him, Baruch Kvasnicka.
Okay.
And so toward the end of the second day, he took me aside privately. He was very polite. He said, "Dr. McDermott, I've really appreciated your books. I had already published a bunch of books by then, and I really appreciate your books and blah blah blah. But are you familiar with this train of scholarship? These scholars, da 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 da." And I said, "No, I can't say I've ever heard of them." "Well, how about this string of scholarship, da 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 da, these books and these authors?" And I say, "No, I don't think I've ever heard of those either." So I went back to the hotel that night and I told my wife, Jean, I said, "Jean, I think Brian is telling me that everything I'm saying is wrong."
Yeah.
So I was humbled by that, of course. And I went back, at the end of the tour, I went back to the States. I was a full-time professor, teaching and lecturing on the road. And I was determined. I'd written down all these sources that this guide had given me, and I was determined to read them, which I did, which led me to more, which then led me to more and more and more. And you know how that goes when you go deep into research.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, about a year later, after reading and reading and reading and reading, I woke up one morning and I realized that God was looking very different. Jesus was looking very different. And the gospel was looking very different. Everything had changed. And so I said, there's a lot of people like me. I've got to start writing about this. So that was when I started to write on this subject. And that was 4 books ago and probably 100 articles ago.
Wow. And that's the way it should be. I think, like I said, the truth should affect our minds. And I think, quite frankly, most Christians, regardless of system or, theological background or denomination or whatever, I think most Christians are functional New Age theologians. Most people operate from the standpoint of whatever I'm feeling, I'm informing my mind, and then comes out my worldview. And, I just think I think Scripture just teaches us the opposite of that. And you can disagree with me if you want, but it's like, if we're supposed to be renewing our minds, it's our minds that then inform our hearts, which are deceitful. And that should be the thing that then from where our worldview comes, right? So if we're not open to changing our minds, how can our hearts ever be manipulated towards the truth? Okay, so we're going to get into the Zionism here and biblical Zionism. But before we do that, I just want to hear, this is a term that's thrown around a lot. And I feel like most in the media today, and certainly in social network, arena, Zionism is used more of a political term. So I'm curious, when you say you're a Zionist, when you say maybe you're a biblical Zionist, what do you mean by that?
I call myself a new Christian Zionism.
Okay. This
is a movement that started amongst us scholars maybe about 15 years ago. And it first sprang upon the world in this book that was published 10 years ago, back in 2016 by University Press, and you mentioned it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a collection of essays by a number of us scholars. I put it together. It came out of a conference we had at Georgetown. And the title of the book is The New Christian Zionism. So what do we mean by that? Well, first of all, new being different from dispensationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Most scholars, and a lot of Christians who are not scholars, but are familiar with the term dispensationalism, particularly coming out of Dallas Seminary, most who are outside that camp despise it. And our project has nothing to, and whether or not they're right to despise it, I don't think they are right to despise it, but I never have been one.
Mm-hmm.
And our movement called the New Christian Zionism has nothing to do theologically,
mm-hmm.
structurally, with dispensationalism, which started just in the mid-19th century by a priest who was an Anglican. So don't listen to Anglican priests. um, but New Christian Zionism has nothing to do with dispensationalism, and part of it is the rapture. I personally don't believe in the rapture. I don't believe it's biblical. I don't think it's good theology. And so our project has nothing to do with dispensationalism. And it's new also because whereas classic dispensationalists are never willing to say anything negative about the state of Israel, we are.
Mm-hmm.
But it's new also because we say that, well, it's 2,000 years old. It didn't start in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Christian Zionism has been in the thinking of the church. It's all over the New Testament. In fact, it's on the surface of the New Testament. And the reason why we scholars and preachers and pastors who have gone to seminary haven't seen it in the New Testament is because we've been told it's not there. And when you're told something is not there, you tend not to see it.
Yeah, you don't look for it. Yeah.
Right. So Christian is Christian Zionism as opposed to simply Jewish Zionism, as opposed to secular Zionism. So Zionism itself means the idea that the Jews have a right to live in their ancestral homeland, just like every other people has a right to live in its ancestral homeland. And Zionism, of course, even secular Zionism, proclaims rightly that the Jews have been there for 4,000 years. And Muslims, for example, are the true colonial settlers who came to the land upwards of 2,600 years after the Jews had already been there and have been living in the land all along.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the leaders were kicked out several times, and especially then in 135 AD by the Romans after the Second Jewish Revolt. But some always stayed in the land, and they resettled up in Galilee and other parts. The Jews have always been there continuously for 4,000 years. This is their ancestral homeland. So that's what Zionism means, and we Jews have a right to live in our ancestral homeland. Now, Christian, that's a secular Jewish definition of Zionism. Now, there's also the religious Jewish definition of Zionism, which I support too. I, as a new Christian Zionist, support too. But I'm a Christian Zionist saying that these truths are not only taught in the Hebrew Bible, they're also taught in the New Testament. They're all over the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. So,
and twofold, that the Jewish people are still the chosen people. And Christian supersessionists, like my friend N.T. Wright, says, no, that they're no longer the chosen people. After Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father in roughly 30 AD, we would guess, God changed his plans, which he said were eternal. In Jeremiah 31, 35 and 36, the Jews will always be a chosen nation, will always be a nation before me as long as the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. And I'm looking out my window right now.
That's right.
And I can't see the sun, but I know the sun is there because it's bright daytime. Even though where you're at,
still doing its thing here too.
Daytime.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Jews are still God's chosen people. And as Paul makes it very clear in Romans 11, 28 and 29, and he's talking specifically about the Jews who rejected Jesus as Messiah. He says they're still beloved,
mm-hmm.
and their calling is irrevocable. Now, calling is a technical term, klesis,
mm-hmm.
In New Testament Greek, for God calling the Jews to be his chosen people. It's irrevocable. It cannot be revoked. It's not canceled.
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, the land is still the Holy Land. Now, supersessionist N.T. Wright is the leader, the most influential biblical scholar and theologian in the world today, bar none. Nobody comes close to N.T. Wright. He's influential in his supersessionism on Protestants, on Pentecostals, on Anglicans, on Catholics, and even on the Eastern Orthodox. N.T. Wright is so significant, so influential, the most influential Christian thinker and preacher and theologian particularly, and Bible scholar particularly, on Christians thinking about the meaning of Israel. So he also says the land is no longer the Holy Land. Once the first century of Jews, the majority rejected Jesus as Messiah, God transferred all those covenantal promises from the Jewish people to the largely now Gentile church. And so the new Christian Zionism, an answer, a long-winded answer to your question, that's why it's new, that's why it's Christian, and that's why it's called Zionism.
Yeah. And something that I thank you for that. It's always good to be, clear as far as when we start using terms, what we mean by that. And so I something to consider. I even go further. I say that, yes, we are, as Jews, as Israel, we are God's chosen people. But I think people forget that we are a literal created nation. Sarai's womb was barren, Genesis 11:30, I believe it is. And there's a line here that of barren women that could not have children, and Hagar wouldn't work. Maybe not because she was, not from whatever line or whatever. It was because that wasn't God's doing. Like God said, look, this is the way it's going to be. And that way, this is a creation of mine. So yes, we're chosen. It's throughout the Hebrew Bible that's the language that's used. But also, it's like, did God not know what he was doing when he made something from nothing here with this nation that would not have existed if he didn't intervene in these super old people's lives? But also Sarai's womb was, in the Hebrew, it was literally sterile. So just something I like to throw in there for people to think about. Not just chosen, God was much more intimate in the beginning of this nation than people want to give credit for,
And David, let me add a little bit to Christian Zionism.
Okay.
Because I talk mostly about the Jews as God's chosen people, still God's chosen people in the New Testament. The Zionist part is, for the purposes of this conversation, even more important. Paul says in Romans 11:29, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Now, what did he mean by gifts? Well, he lists the gifts in Romans 9. He doesn't specifically say the land, but they're implied because, and how do we know this? For all Jewish intellectuals in the first century at the time of Paul, so think of Josephus, the Jewish historian. Think of Philo of Alexandria, the great philosopher. Think of Ezekiel, the tragedian. They all talked about the gifts that God has given us Jews. They're all in the first century. They're all contemporaries of Paul. And at the top of their list, or near the very top, for each one of them is the land. Now, we have proof that Paul too believed this, because Luke tells us in Acts chapter 13, starting in verse 16, that Paul is preaching a sermon in Antioch of Pisidia, which is modern-day Turkey. And he's preaching in a synagogue. His audience is both Jews and Gentiles. And we know the Gentiles are there because he talks about those of you who are God-fearers, and that was Luke's technical term back then, and amongst Jews back then, of these thousands and thousands and thousands of Gentiles who came to the synagogue on Saturday morning, because once they came, they usually came back because they recognized immediately that this God of Israel is the true God, not all these gods and goddesses from Rome and Greece that we've been strangled with. And so Paul says in this sermon, he says, God, the God of Israel, raised up our fathers and brought them out of slavery in Egypt, and he brought them to this land. And after destroying, now the syntax suggests that it's God, not just Joshua, who destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan. So God destroyed them. And I find that interesting because most Christians and Jews who have been through the university and have taken their courses in religious studies, they've been told that the book of Joshua is an example of Jewish genocide
Right.
ordered by God.
Mhm.
It's the hardest book in the Bible for them to defend these days in the 21st century. Paul is not has no problem with defending it.
Right. Yeah.
He says God destroyed these 7 Canaanite nations and gave their land to our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as an inheritance.
Mm.
Now, what's significant about this is, number one, this is not a residual leftover from Paul's pre-Damascus road experience that he was that was hanging over and he later got rid of. No, this is probably 57 AD.
Mhm.
That's most scholars guess about when Paul was there, just a few years before Nero cuts his head off.
Yeah.
In Rome. This is more than 25 years after Paul's meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus. Paul is still believing this and teaching this and preaching the land promise.
Yeah.
Now, I studied New Testament at the University of Chicago and this divinity school, then more of the New Testament and Christian theology and Jewish theology and Islamic theology at the University of Iowa for my PhD years later. And I was told by all my professors and all the scholars I read that the land promise is not in the New Testament. And I remember the first time I read this in Acts 13, I go, whoa, 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 whoa.
Yeah.
They said it wasn't there. Paul could not have been more explicit about the land promise. God gave to the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he calls them our fathers. That's what he means. As an inheritance, gave them the land of the Canaanites, the 7 nations, as an inheritance. He could not have been more specific. So, and Jesus, in Matthew 5, verse 18, he says, as long as the heaven and earth stay in existence, he's probably referring to Jeremiah 31, 35, and 36, where God makes the same promise through Jeremiah. He says every iota, which is the smallest letter in the Greek alphabet, and choria. Now, that's the Greek word for horn. Now, what's a horn? Well, horn is the Hebrew term for the smallest stroke of the pen in Hebrew, not as part of a letter, but a kind of over
decorative stroke. Yeah.
Stroke, small stroke of the pen will be fulfilled and will never fall, as he says. Pipto uses the Greek word in Luke, a parallel passage, will be accomplished, every single one. So every stroke of the pen. Now, I've gone through the Hebrew Bible thoroughly for years, and I have recorded in both the New Christian Zionism and also in Israel Matters at the back all the times that the land promise in what Christians call the Old Testament is expressed either explicitly, and we counted 500 times, more than 500 times, or implicitly more than 500 times, for a total of more than 1,000 times. Jesus is saying here in Matthew 5, 17 and 18, especially verse 18, that God inscribed every stroke of the pen in the Hebrew Bible, all 1,000 times that land promise. There is no question, but Jesus could not have expressed with greater reverence the truth of the Hebrew Bible on those 1,000 expressions of the land promise. There is no doubt that Jesus believed in and taught the land promise, that Jesus was a Zionist.
You know, I had a video taken down by YouTube because in the video, it was flagged for hate speech. I was addressing the Christ is King crowd, and kind of talking about that phrase, and giving some of my own family history about my dad being called a Christ killer, as a kid, and all these kinds of things. And so I was getting the history of behind some of the vitriol behind what's being now used, which on paper itself, the phrase is fine, right? But the statement that got the video taken down was that Christ is King is the most Zionistic statement you can make. And they flagged it, and they took it for hate speech, and it got taken down, which is just crazy. I mean, it's YouTube. Like the committee taking videos down is like purple haired and disagrees with everything that we would believe. So, but I guess where I'm going with this is, I mean, where do you see where does Zionism ultimately come to fruition? I have my own beefs with dispensationalism. I actually went to a dispensational school started by C.I. Schofield. I understand the positions well. Some I agree with, some I disagree with. I actually fundamentally disagree with the definition of Israel under classical dispensationalism. But ultimately, most people of the, let's just call it evangelical world, that believe there is a future for Israel, whether or not they believe in whatever system, who knows, would ultimately say, look, Zionism comes to full biblical fruition when Yeshua is ruling and reigning physically from Jerusalem. That would be, whether or not that's at the end of 1,000 years or some other form or whatever, because there's different people believe in that. Without getting into like systematized belief systems or whatever, like where do you see Zionism coming to fruition? Like what will be like the ultimate fulfillment of that?
Well, no, you just added something. You said the first way you expressed the question was where do you see Zionism coming to fruition, and then you used the word ultimate.
Okay.
And I would.
I use words all the time. I don't mean to. So, however you want to phrase your question and answer, it's fine with me.
Well, and the reason why I make that distinction in the two ways that you asked the question, is because I think many Christians looking at this question think of it in punctiliar terms rather than progressive terms, and I don't mean political progressivism or theological progressivism.
Sure.
And I would point to the hermeneutical key.
Okay.
And hermeneutics is a fancy theological word for how to interpret. And I would say not the key, but a key is Matthew 17. And Jesus is being asked about if Elijah will come, because the prophets said, Malachi especially, that before the Messiah comes, Elijah will come. And he says, yes, actually Elijah has come. It was John the Baptist. John the Baptist, he said, will let me see, how does he put it exactly? I'll grab off my shelf the New Revised Standard in Matthew 17. He will
by the way, folks, while Dr. McDermott's looking that up, I'm going to put in the show notes about a dozen articles that he's recently written that I think you really should spend time and run through. These are really, really good. You need to check out.
Right. Yes. So he says in verse 11 that Elijah is indeed coming and will restore all things. Jesus said John the Baptist will restore all things. Now, did John the Baptist restore all things? Most of us would say no.
Right.
But I think this is a hermeneutical key. How to interpret eschatology. And eschatology means theology of end times.
Right.
Eschatos is the Greek word for last or final or later. Not just to use your last word, ultimate,
Okay. Yeah.
Um, so I would suggest to you that this is a verse in which Jesus is signaling to us that the end times is at least thousands of years of stages, stage after stage after stage after stage. And I talk about this in my big new book, A New History of Redemption.
Okay.
So what's the fruition of Zionism? Well, we're living in one stage of it.
Right.
Look, one incredibly significant phase was the return of Jews from the four corners of the earth, starting in the 18th century.
That's right.
Not just the 19th century, in the 18th century, when rabbis started bringing their people back to the land.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the 19th century and the 20th century is still going on. Jews are fleeing, rightly so, countries like the United States and France and England and Germany, and Australia, where they're being killed in the streets for the great crime of being a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some dispensationalists, some Christian Zionists say, well, the state of Israel is prophesied by the Bible. I don't think so. The return of the Jews is prophesied. I don't see this state, and particularly this current state, being prophesied. But look, if anything if we've learned anything in the last 100 years, it's that the Jews need a state.
Yeah.
And the protection of an army to protect them against the millions and millions of people, and particularly their neighbors, who want to just drive them all into the sea.
Yeah.
So what is the fruition of Zionism? Well, the first modern fruit was the return of Jews to the land. Second was the establishment of the state. A third phase, a third stage, was 1967,
Mm-hmm.
when it was the beginning of the end of the times of the Gentiles. And why do I say that? Because Jesus talks in Luke 21 about the times of the Gentiles, and the process. Again, it's a process.
Right.
Of the end of that, when the Gentiles stopped trampling on Jerusalem. Well, what does trample upon mean? It's a technical term
Mm-hmm.
from the prophetic books, and it refers to military and political control.
Okay.
So now that started in 1948, when the Jews gained control of West Jerusalem, but of course they didn't have control over all Jerusalem, the Gentiles, and after 1950, it was the Jordanians had
Right.
control of East Jerusalem. But in 1967, the Jews gained control of all of Jerusalem. And so that was a significant stage in the process of the end of Gentiles trampling upon Jerusalem. But we're still undergoing things. Now, many people would say, and I don't dispute them, that a future stage is the building of a third temple.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of Christians would say, well, we can't permit that. I mean, that's crazy. That's why in the world. Well, in 2 Thessalonians 2, Paul talks about the Antichrist.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I just gave a sermon on this yesterday. He talks about God sending a delusion there. And I tried to explain in my sermon why God was, what that could possibly mean. The author of truth
Mm-hmm.
sending a delusion. And I tried to explain that, and that might be another podcast because we don't have time to unpack that. But in 2 Thessalonians 2, where it says God sends a delusion, it also says the Antichrist will proclaim himself to be God in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if your viewers believe the final Antichrist has not come yet, well, it talks about the final Antichrist proclaiming himself to be God in the temple. Well, what temple is that?
Right.
And I've, as I've explained in some podcasts and various places, if they would say, well, how can Christian believers who believe that Jesus was the final sacrifice how could they possibly accept the future possibility of a new temple with new animal sacrifices? I mean, Jesus already made the perfect sacrifice. Say, well, turn to Acts 21, where Paul is paying for the animal sacrifices of 4 companions.
That's right.
And for himself.
Yeah.
And turn to Acts 4 and 5, when Peter and John are leading the new Christian, the tiny little Christian church, you might say. Messianic church is what Christian means, messianic.
Right.
Christos means the anointed one, which is what Moshiach means.
Right.
To participate in liturgies of the temple, the Sadducean leaders of whom had just killed Jesus. Their Messiah. But they're going back to the temple and participating in these liturgies. And remember what Jesus said in Matthew 23, in his long denunciation of the Pharisees for being hypocrites, but in verses 2 and 3, praising all Pharisaic teachings, not just some, but all of them. Most Christians and scholars miss that. He praises not just some, but all the teachings of the Pharisees in verses 2 and 3. And then in verse 21, he says, God resides in the temple. What? Now he knows, I mean, he's God. He knows the future.
Right.
Although he purposely limited his own complete knowledge of the future while he was on earth as the suffering servant.
Sure.
But he says, he knows these leaders are going to turn against him, and they're probably going to kill him. And yet he says God still dwells there. He condemns the leadership for their corruption, but he says God still is in this temple. Now, your readers might think, well, how can you possibly say that in a religious organization that's corrupt, that God can still be there? Well, have you ever read Paul's letters to the Romans and to the Ephesians,
right,
and
Corinthians,
and to the Galatians, where there's immorality and there's heresy and false teaching from the leaders, and yet Paul says you are the body of what? Messiah. What? The body of Messiah in the midst of all this heresy and corruption and immorality? Yep. And that's because we human beings are those crazy creatures whom God created with a free will. And we typically corrupt ourselves. And we typically turn away from the true God, even though we've been chosen by the true God. So I told you, I said far more than you probably wanted me to.
No. It was all really good. I mean, it brings to, for my mind, I love getting your perspective on this, because most people that are pro-Israel are unaware of your side of the equation. They're unaware that there is anyone even reformed that holds your points of view. And most, I'm sorry. We'll get into that in a minute. That's actually a really good point.
Okay.
But because I want to hear from you on that, because some of these articles that you wrote were kind of addressed that too. So,
yeah.
But okay, so let me back up for a second. My challenge to the evangelical pro-Israel community is, first of all, I say thank you to, let's just say, my father's generation. My father became a follower of Yeshua back in the Jesus movement in California, actually in Hawaii, but then moved to California. He went to a seminary called Jesus Christ Light and Powerhouse, which other believing Jews had. It was like DTS guides went and started kind of a hippy-dippy seminary out in California during the Jesus movement.
Right.
It's this whole kind of intercultural thing that happened. And I call it the Great Pause, because from kind of that revolution until recently, let's just say 50, 60 years from that point to relatively recently, there was a pause on the status quo from the church of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment. Anyone who spends any time reading church history knows, and I think it actually might have been an Archbishop of Canterbury that made this statement. I could be wrong, but that the Jews have memorized the pages of history that Christians have torn out. And so many Christians just don't even realize that that is the history of the church. Now, again, whether it's small c, we're talking institutionally here, all these things, I get it. But it has been the status quo for most of church history, have a negative view or even a persecutory position against the Jewish people. And in the Jesus movement, and this is my own analysis, I could be wrong, but I see this pause that happens for a couple of reasons. One, we're post-Holocaust, and so the appetite for Jew hatred probably isn't what it used to be because everyone kind of recognizes what had just happened. But second of all, you have a large group of people that have, a revival, if you will, that have come to faith, and they are calling upon themselves and following people that are saying, look, let's get back to biblical basics. Let's just read the Bible for ourselves. Let's have more of a historical grammatical hermeneutic here. And when they started reading their Bibles in that way, they came away with, wow, well, the Jewish people seem like there's still a thing, right? It seems like God's still moving and working in the, Jewish people. And then, of course, 1967 is right then, and all these things are happening in Israel, and people had seen the rebirth of the nation, all these things happening. So, but my criticism on this, I promise I'll let you talk here in a second, Dr. McDermott. But my criticism on this crowd, which I love them, and they put out good work and all these things, was the hyper myopic focus on end times, on the rapture, and on what is, and then we get into newspaper exegesis. Every headline coming out of Israel for the past 40 years is scrutinized and forced into some biblical passage to complete a narrative that everyone is hoping is being fulfilled. I get the desire. The desire is good. They want to see God working. We want to see things happening in our lifetimes, which things are happening in our lifetime before our very eyes. But it dehumanized the Jewish people. It dehumanized and really kind of made Israel this fantasy fairy tale of a people that weren't really in the land. Like, people knew we're here, but we ceased to be a human entity in the created nation of God, and we're relegated to a puzzle piece in someone's eschatology. And quite frankly, and this gets into our kind of the next where I'm going next here is, how do we end up in the position that we're in, where my generation, a little bit older than me, but certainly younger than me, is now completely abandoned the pro-Israel or even, God's chosen people standpoint. And these are evangelicals. These are the children of the Jesus movement people. And I think to me, it's a cry wolf scenario. And again, I agree with some of the eschatology from these folks. But one of the reasons why I appreciate your perspective is that I want people to understand that you don't have to agree on all the eschatology that you've heard from the pro-Israel side of the equation to understand a biblical rooted and correct identity of Israel, because ultimately God is not judging us by having perfect theology, but there is a judgment for those people that go against the Jewish people. There is a cursing for people who go against the nation of Israel.
True. Yeah.
There's also, of course, a blessing for those that bless Israel. But so, as you know, we have the Rooted Kingdom Conference coming up, and hopefully, you can be a part of that. Well, obviously, we'll talk about that later. But I lost my train of thought. But real quick, then I'll get your comment on this. My heart and desire, and the reason why I'm even doing the Rooted Kingdom conferences and bringing Israelis to speak at these things, is because I could kind of care less about people's eschatology if their very person in their soul is rebelling against God in their view of the Jewish people. And I think there's consequence for that right here and now. You don't have to agree with that, but that's kind of my current thing. So having said all that, that's kind of why I think and how we've gotten to where we are with the current situation of anti-Semitism rising in the church. We spoke last time, years ago, well before October 7th. In your own ministry, in your teaching and everything in the New Christian Zionist world, what has been in your experience? What has surprised you before dealing with the side of the equation that disagrees with you, and after October 7th? It was no more than 2 weeks after October 7th that there was a podcast by a group called Apologia that put out a podcast criticizing Israel's actions, saying that they are not true Jews, that the church are the true Jews. And I'm like, look, even if you have that standpoint and I disagree with you, fine. Why are you choosing 2 weeks after the worst massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust for this timing? Does that make sense? Sorry, I know that was a lot, Dr. McDermott, but yeah, what are your thoughts on any of that you wanted to respond? Sorry, that was a little bit of a rant. I get on a soapbox and I can't stop myself.
Well, I think I'll say a few things.
Yeah.
I'm of your father's generation, and I came to, I wouldn't say first faith, but second faith in the Jesus Revolution. Through, amazingly, to most of your listeners, maybe even to you, through the Catholic charismatic movement. I was born and raised a Roman Catholic.
Catholic charismatic movement. Is that what you said?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I came to see Jesus, the true Jesus, for the first time through the Catholic charismatic movement. So,
wow.
Through the Catholics, Roman Catholics. I was raised a Roman Catholic. I'm a Boston Irishman.
Yeah.
And my parents were 100% Irish, which makes me 100% Irish. And I went to a Jesuit high school in New York City. And in the late 60s. So I didn't graduate until 1970. And the country was deeply divided then over the Vietnam War. And so, and Israel was not on my radar at all then. And as I said, it wasn't until about 25 years ago. And I think, and then I started writing, and I found a lot of pushback before October 7th in Christian audiences, Catholic and Anglican, Baptist, Pentecostal, you name it. For two reasons, I think, in hindsight. Number one, because they've been taught replacement theology, supersessionism from the pulpit, because their pastors were taught this in seminary, both Catholic and Protestant. But actually, the Catholics were better theologically than the Protestants, believe it or not. Were better than a lot of evangelicals who had gone to evangelical supersessionist seminaries.
Is that in part, sorry to interrupt, but just for my own clarifications, I'm really interested in this.
Yeah.
Is that in part because of Vatican II?
Yes.
Okay.
And Nostra Aetate, which was a huge about face. I would say, as a non-Roman Catholic now, I'm no longer a Roman Catholic, though I'm sort of an Anglo-Catholic. This was an about face. I mean, basically, in Nostra Aetate, this is a very important document, 1965, at the end of Vatican II, it was published, said, we have been wrong in saying that all Jews are Christ killers, in blaming Jews of every generation for the death of Jesus 2,000 years ago. And secondly, we have been wrong for suggesting that God's covenant with the Jewish people as his chosen people has not been ongoing. It has been. Nostra Aetate was very clear about that. And they quoted Paul, Romans 11, 28 and 29.
Wow.
And most Protestants have been forever wrong on that, and haven't caught up, except for the dispensationalists, and many of the Baptists. But now even a lot of them are changing. So that's the first reason why before October 7th, I think most Christians in all the big denominations were not taking what I was trying to give them. The second reason is because Christians don't read the Bible.
Right.
Evangelicals, back in the 70s and the 80s, they read the Bible, and going into the 90s. But once they got their cell phones, they stopped reading the Bible. And they are no longer people who read the Bible, evangelicals. Now, of course, there's plenty of exceptions.
Sure.
But generally, evangelicals are no better than anyone else, no better than Catholics today on Bible reading. Most Christians do not read the Bible and do not know the Bible. And when you don't read the Bible, and when particularly 99% of your sermons that you hear on Sunday morning, if you go to church, and most Christians don't even go to church every Sunday. When 99% of your sermons are on the New Testament and pretty much ignore the Old Testament, it's no wonder you hear nothing about in your sermons the significance of Jesus being a Jew. Now, by the way, we Anglicans are having the first ever conference on the significance of Jesus being a Jew in a Dallas suburb, October 21st, for your listeners. And they can look it up and just Google Jesus is a Jew Anglican Conference, Dallas, October 21st. Jesus is a Jew Anglican Conference. It should come up. So I think, David, those are the two reasons why Christians generally before October 7th, since in this day of cell phones, have been supersessionists. Now, since October 7th, it's gotten worse.
Yeah.
Because of that terrible thing called cell phone and social media. And social media is dominated with bots, not even real human beings anymore.
Yeah.
Who multiplied by the millions, anti-Semitic and anti-Israel messages. And particularly for Gen Z, teenagers and 20 and 30 somethings, that's their number one source of news. I mean, it's tragic. It's like it's like living in Germany in the 20s and the 30s, and your number one source of news is the Nazi Party.
That's right.
So, but things are happening that I say are optimistic. Many of your young men, much more than young women, who have been raised as evangelicals, are hungry for something more than what they've been getting in these big box churches.
Yeah.
With these watered down messages, God loves you and wants your best, and and Jesus forgives everything. So the implied message is, as long as I believe in my head that Jesus died for my sins, that's all that matters, and I can live like the devil, and go out and do porn and go to church once or twice a month and feel good about yourself, and you hear the same feel good therapeutic message, and never hear anything about Israel, or if you do, it's the Jews have rejected Jesus, and notice what the implication of that is. What Christians have heard from the pulpit for most of the last 1,700 years. Most Jews rejected Jesus, therefore they're no longer the chosen people. God has given up on the Jews. He's transferred the covenant to the Gentile church. So if God has given up on the Jews, and they're a stiff-necked people for rejecting God's Son, then we should give up on the Jews too. It just stands to reason. So this is what we're battling. But as I said, young men are rejecting this. They've grown up with it. They've been demonized by the culture, toxic masculinity, especially young white men.
Yeah.
But even young brown men and black men are getting this, and they're seeing through it. They're seeing that this was racist and sexist. What's wrong with being a man, and what's wrong with being white or a young man? And they are searching for history. They sense in their gut that something is wrong here. They know the importance of sexual difference, and they've been told by the culture, it doesn't matter if you're a man or woman, you're really the same. And if you're a man, you feel like a woman, well, you really are a woman. If you're a woman, you feel like a man, you really are a man. And it doesn't matter All that matters is what you think in your head. And they knew deep down that this is wrong. And they can't tell you why, but they know it is.
Mm-hmm.
And they know any religion that doesn't demand a transformation of their life is a cheap religion not worth following.
Mm.
And they've been going back to liturgy and sacraments, and they're much more open to the significance of the Jewishness of Jesus.
Mm.
And I'm seeing this. I did a lecture tour with my wife last September of Sweden and of England. And then we've been to Israel a few times. We see it even in Israel. And I did a lecture tour of Eastern Europe, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Singapore. We did a conference in Singapore. And we're seeing it all over, that young men are particularly waking up, and they're very, very open to hearing the truth about Israel.
Mm. Well, that's encouraging. That's encouraging, because it, well, there's a problem now with, let me put it this way, even the congregations where the pastors are preaching the word of God and are preaching truth about Israel and are not bending. But as you said, that algorithm is running 24/7 on its congregation. And that's really a war that no one's even, I mean, in the social media world, there's a couple people, like I bring it up all the time or whatever, but until people understand that they need to be fighting in their own congregations to ensure that they're not being overwhelmed by this literal beast online, right? And just for our listeners, at the Rooted Kingdom conferences, both in Texas and in Georgia, which you guys know the dates of that, it's on the website. But one of our speakers is an Israeli he's ex-special forces, hostage negotiator, rescuer guy. Amazing, unbelievable stories, but he's an expert on what's going on online right now, how all the bots are being funded, and how Islam and countries like Iran and Qatar and Saudi Arabia are helping to fund anti-Israel propaganda. And people don't understand how deep it goes and how organized the effort is from Islam against the nation state of Israel and the Jewish people in general. So that's interesting to hear about Europe too. That is, so I guess you said something earlier, and hopefully this has been clarifying for people, but you said you're not Reformed. That's because Anglican is
Reformed.
What's that?
I was Reformed.
You were Reformed. Okay.
This is another one of my conversions.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So one of the articles that you wrote is attacking anti-Semitism among the Reformed. I thought that was really interesting. Speak a little bit to that, because one of my concerns is, because I 100% agree. Like I've really tracked. Well, actually, one of the chapters in our book is called, in The Rooted Kingdom, is called "Can You Blame Them?" And it's all about the young men demographic leading the mile-wide, inch-deep church, looking for something substantive. Okay, and a lot of those are going straight to Christian nationalism in some kind of mainline denominational, feels like something real platform. Pick your poison as far as like, not poison, but ilk as far as like system or theology or whatever. And obviously embedded in most of those is replacement theology, anti-Israel sentiment. So what kind of summarize for people when you attacking anti-Semitism among the Reformed? Maybe we'll close with this and some words of hope and wisdom for the future, but speak to that a little bit, because I think that's important. Well,
first of all, the Reformed tradition is not inherently anti-Semitic.
Right.
I want to say that.
Right.
And there are plenty philo-Semitic and pro-Israel Reformed theologians and writers. I used to be thoroughly Reformed. I'm a I've written several million words probably on Jonathan Edwards, and he, I think, was the greatest Reformed theologian ever, greater than Calvin.
Wow.
And he broke with Calvin on some things, thankfully, particularly the meaning of Israel. Now, Calvin was a supersessionist, as was Luther, so notoriously. It doesn't mean there's nothing good that Luther ever said. Doesn't mean there's nothing good that Calvin ever said. And the Reformed tradition is meaty, substantive, and deep. And the Reformed confessions, there is much truth in the Reformed confessions that we can learn from. And talk about meaty and deep. I mean, it's extremely meaty and deep. Unlike much of the stuff that's preached in these big box churches by people who are Reformed. And it's not to say there aren't some big box churches that are really good and are deep and substantive. So after clearing away all that detritus and possible sources of misunderstanding and misallegation, in the article you're referring to that I published at the Christian Post about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah, January of 2025.
Yeah, so a year and a half ago now. I was exposing the anti-Semitism amongst leading Reformed podcasters like Joel Webbin and Stephen Wolfe, who wrote The Virtue of a book on Christian nationalism. And they all were trained at Moscow, Idaho by Doug Wilson.
Oh.
Now, Doug Wilson himself, I don't think is anti-Semitic. And he put out an Antioch declaration about a year and a half ago, which I write about in that article.
Right.
Which was to criticize anti-Semitism. And yet, even in the declaration, this Antioch declaration, as I point out in the article, there are really some strange things that seem to target Jews in unfair ways, even in the midst of this declaration against anti-Semitism. And Joel Webbin is a radical anti-Semite. Stephen Wolfe is a radical anti-Semite, and there are signs of this in his book on Christian nationalism. Now, they are not inherently tied to the Reformed tradition. These are not necessary results of Reformed theology, as Jonathan Edwards himself shows. Jonathan Edwards was a Christian Zionist. I've published on this. His posthumously published lectures on the history of redemption, which led, by the way, to the evangelization of the Global South that has resulted in the Global South now being the center of future world Christianity. Almost all those missionaries brought with them the sermons, the history of redemption, posthumously published by Jonathan Edwards, as their principal missiological imperative, fueling and sustaining their missions to and in the Global South, in China and in Africa principally. And he was a Christian Zionist.
Right.
Back in the 18th century, when the Ottoman Empire was firmly in control of the Middle East and the land of Israel, he was saying, and you know, Jews were there in small numbers up in Galilee, but not very many in Jerusalem. He was saying, we know for certain that the Jews are going to return to the land, and they will set up a polity, and they will once again make Jerusalem the center of the world before the end of history.
Right.
Not just in the eschaton, but before the end of history. So now I departed from the Reformed tradition some time ago, and I would say, and please forgive me, you Reformed listeners who are listening to me now. I would say because I read too much of the Bible and was more open to non-reformed interpretations of the Bible than I had been used to, than I had been carrying for many years as a reformed theologian and Edwardsian theologian and a writer. In short, and I'll leave it at this, and this will open a can of worms for all the Reformed and for many of your readers.
Okay.
I came to break substantially with the classic Reformed doctrine, once saved, always saved.
Okay.
It became clear to me that from Genesis to Revelation, it's a constant warning that even though you've been with Christ, the Messiah, or the future Messiah in the Hebrew Bible, or that you're hoping for a place in the world to come, as Jews would say, you might be there today, but don't presume, because you can fall away from the covenant and you can lose it. And if you're open to that message, then you start to see that all over the New Testament. Jesus says it's only those who persevere till the end. That's Matthew 24. You must persevere until the end. Don't put your trust in this emotional, spiritual experience that you had when you were 17 or 7 or 27, and might have been truly from the Holy Spirit, as Hebrews 6 made very clear. And Hebrews 3 as well. But just because you had that true experience from the Holy Spirit, and you might have been born again, doesn't mean that you cannot and that you will not walk away from it. Persevere until the end. That is the constant message of all of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation.
That was a can of worms. You did kick it open. No, but look. This is obviously that's a major issue, and to me that's a. But what do I say here? That obviously soteriology, major issue. But again, we have lost the ability in the world in general, but certainly in Christianity, to even dialogue about these things. I think that people want to find their camp, be comfortable that I have this box checked, and I can go think about other things now. My pastor's got that covered. My favorite author's got that covered. And I like what he says. And therefore, I don't want anything to creep in that would make me have to now question everything that he's written, And I refuse to live that way, okay? I refuse to live in a world where I'm beholden to someone else to determine for me what is true or not. But that takes individual responsibility. And it's something that it's interesting, up until like the 50s or 60s, to be a Presbyterian minister, you had to be trained in Hebrew and Greek to a very, very high level. You had to be able to study the Bible for yourself in the original languages. And obviously we're not there anymore. And certainly no evangelical pastors are. If you're an evangelical, you're on your own as far as like presbytery or whatever, a hierarchy. But I preach on this channel all the time how important it is for people to have a basic understanding of Hebrew first and then Greek specifically, because how do you know whether Dr. McDermott or I are telling you the truth? How can you check these things for yourself? And it is incumbent upon you as just a follower of God to be a Berean, to take upon yourself that requirement of, okay, no, if I want to have an opinion on this, if I want to be secure in the thing that I believe or whatever, I want to be able to check out for myself. It doesn't mean that you have to be able to read it out loud or teach it or anything else, but you need to be able to check for yourself, right? I think most people are to the point where, they own a car and don't even know how to check the tire pressure. Like that's where we are as far as our theological and biblical understanding, as you were saying, as far as people just not even reading the text anymore, which is absolutely true. There's a whole nother subject I kind of wanted to get into, but I think people are probably more tired than me. in their appetite for whatever. But this has been fascinating for me, and I know it's been fascinating for a lot of people. And I guess finally here, Dr. McDermott, like, what is, I guess, for the listener that has always viewed and only hears dispensationalism when they hear about Israel, what is, and you already kind of briefly touched on this before, but kind of, what is a message to that person regarding the importance of understanding who and what Israel is in God's plan, past, present, and future? And then just a message of hope for where you think God is leading us in this really troublesome time of anti-Semitism.
Well, first, to the dispensationalists, I want to congratulate you for holding on to the true biblical teaching and theological teaching that the Jews are still the chosen people and the land is still the Holy Land. And I congratulate your scholarly leaders of previous generations who had the courage to keep saying that while being despised by the academy. And it's not a bad thing. It's often a sign of truth that anybody is despised by the theological academy. I've been in the academy for 40 years, and it's totally corrupted. So I would always encourage people to give a second listen to those whom the academy despises. Secondly, I would say that I personally disagree with dispensationalism because much of it, not all of it, is grounded in this doctrine of the rapture, which makes Jesus's final coming his third coming, and the rapture, the second coming or middle coming, which I don't find in Scripture anywhere, and the proof text, 1 Thessalonians 4 and Matthew, one will be taken to their bed and from their bed, and the other will stay there. I think if you look in the literary context, it's not referring to a middle coming, but a final coming. And secondly, classical dispensationalism talks about the Jews being the carnal people, the Christians being the spiritual people, traveling on two parallel tracks throughout history and never intersecting. And if you look at history and even biblical history, it's clear there was constant intersection. So for some of those reasons, I don't happen to follow the dispensationalist line. But your second question, Dave, was, yes, in this period in history, it's a dark time. I'm a realist, which means I'm a pessimist and I'm also an optimist.
Yeah, me too.
I'm a pessimist insofar as look at the history of the world, and I've studied, and I'm trained as a church historian and historian of theology, not just the last 2,000, but the last 4,000 years. And I see that we're following a typical pattern. And the pattern is that things are getting dark, and they're probably going to get darker. And the persecution of true believers is probably going to increase, not decrease. And so our time is to batten down the hatches and prepare for persecution. So I'm a pessimist that way, but I'm an optimist that we're on the winning side of cosmic history, not American history, not European history, but cosmic history, biblical history, that Jesus, the Messiah, is the king, is the true king, and he is going to return, and he's going to be the judge. And, in the early church, in the first 300 years, and actually in the history of Judaism, the final judgment was looked upon as something to look forward to, because our enemies are going to be punished. And we think of punishment and judgments here on earth as something to be afraid of. Well, the suffering persecuted have always welcomed the judgments, because it releases them from their suffering and deals with the people who are making them suffer, be tortured, and executed. So we're on the winning side. Those who believe in Jesus as the Messiah, Son of the God of Israel by the Holy Spirit, we can take hope, which we desperately need in these dark days, and continue to live in love, because we have, as Tolkien put it in Lord of the Rings, we have true truth. And the man, the God man, who is the truth, the way, the truth, and the life.
Amen. Amen. This is Gandalf the White Staff right here, by the way, for your Tolkien reference. Well, Dr. McDermott, I can't thank you enough for coming on. I hope we can do this again when time permits. How can people find you? How can people follow anything that you're writing and find your books?
Well, my talks are all over YouTube. My books are all on Amazon. Just type in Gerald R. McDermott. Now, be careful, because there's another Gerald R. McDermott who died a few years ago, and he writes in New Age children's books.
Okay.
But all the books in theology and history of Christian thought and famous stutterers are by me. So they're all on Amazon, and I've got a zillion articles. Just Google my name, and many of them will come up.
Yeah, good. So everybody, just all of these articles. There's about a dozen articles that Dr. McDermott just sent me, and that will be in the show notes as well. And keep in mind, put on your calendars. October 2nd and 3rd in Lubbock, Texas, the Rooted Kingdom Conference. It's going to be a Friday, Saturday. We have 4 Israeli speakers. We have a couple of apologists that are LDS Mormon apologists coming. There's going to be a workshop on Friday. It's just going to be fantastic. A couple of days. You're not going to, and these are people that you would not normally hear from, because they're not online. They're not names that you're knowing about. These are people in the field working every single day in the trenches, and dealing with very difficult things here in the land of Israel and also elsewhere. So these are the guys you want to hear from. These are the guys that actually know what's going on. These are some of these guys were in Special Forces IDF, and they're also followers of Jesus of Nazareth. And we have Arab believers, we have Druze believers coming. So it's really a gamut of Israeli believing society that you would never hear from, and they need to be heard from. And so check that out. Again, that's Lubbock, Texas, October 2nd and 3rd. And then in Powder Springs, Georgia, the following weekend, October 9th and 10th, we're going to be doing the same thing. God bless you guys. Thanks for listening. Love you guys. And this is David Halevi. Lehitraot.